Hello everyone, in this video we'll go over the process of making these cookie models in Blender. I was inspired by the way the food looked in Howl's Moving Castle. I'll try and explain things slower in the beginning and then speed up as we go through the tutorial, and you can also get this file for free in the description. Let's get into it. So the first thing I'm going to do is going to select everything and hit X to delete everything. What I'm going to do after that is I'm going to hit Shift A and add a circle, and you can reduce the vertices a little bit if you want. The exact count doesn't really matter much though. And what I'm going to do is go into edit mode and hit ES with all the vertices selected, so that we can start to scale out this circle. And if you keep on doing ES, you can kind of make these rings that go out. You can also select the edge loop in the center with Alt click and then hit F to fill it so that the center is now filled. What you can also do is turn on proportional editing and raise up the sides of our circle a bit, and that'll give it a nice plate shape. You can right click and shade smooth after that. After that, we can go to the modifiers tab and add a solidify modifier to give this circle or plate some thickness. And you can play around with the thickness amount to whatever you want. After that, you can add a subdivision surface modifier. And I'm then going to duplicate this plane down with Shift D and then hit S Shift D to kind of make it a bit bigger than the plate on the top. After that, I'm going to add another circle, and this is going to be for our cookie. I'm going to go into edit mode and do the ES thing once again to create these rings coming out from the center. And you have these edge loops with Alt click, and you can hit GG to kind of slide them around. And I'm also going to make the ring on the side kind of go down a bit. And I'm going to hit Control R to add some loop cuts around the edges. And I'm going to hit Alt S to push out those loops a bit. You can also extrude down a bit more and then S to scale in so that the bottom of the cookie kind of goes in a bit. Another good idea is to kind of take the vertices on the side and kind of just move them around to make them a bit irregular so that our cookie isn't like completely normal shaped and it kind of has like these irregular characteristics to it. We can then add a displace modifier after that to give it even further irregularity. And you can hit new to create a new texture with it and set the strength down a bit. And if you go to the textures tab, you can switch the texture to be clouds, which is what I like to use usually. You'll notice that there's an issue though, which is the center of our cookie has this stretching in the center. In order to fix that, what we could do is we can delete the face in the center of the cookie and select the ring that's around that, and then hit F3, type in grid fill, and you can play around with the settings of it, and pretty much it will fill in that circle a little bit better. And you can also move around those vertices with the GG to spread them out so that they're not as tight. Keep in mind you can also play around with the scale of the clouds texture that we made and get it to be whatever you want. After being done with that, I added a solidify modifier to kind of just give our cookie some sort of thickness. If you look at the bottom, you can see now it has some thickness. So now we can start adding some shading. So go to the render tab and add a sun. And you can just rotate it around a bit. I wanted the sun to kind of be like casting a shadow on the right side, so that's what I was doing here. And then what you can do is you can start duplicating around these cookies with Shift D. As you can see I did there, and I just duplicated a bunch of them, made some of them smaller, some of them bigger. But yeah, so we're going to add the material for the plate first. So I'm going to hit the new material button. Okay guys, before we get started with the nodes and stuff, there's a few things I want to make sure you have enabled in your settings. So if you go to edit preferences and in the add-ons tab here, make sure you type in Node Wrangler and you have it enabled, so you can just click this check mark box if it's not enabled. And some other common tactics that I'm going to be using with nodes is if you hit Shift Control click on any node, it will automatically view that node. So you can see I'm hitting Shift Control click on these nodes and it'll automatically view it. And that's just a very important thing you're going to see me do a lot throughout this video. And one other thing I wanted to introduce you to is when we have textures, like if I add a noise texture or something like that in this video at any point, you might see I automatically add these texture coordinate and mapping nodes, and the way I do that is by selecting on the noise texture and then hitting Control T. Those are two things I want you guys to know, is that if you hit Shift Control click on a node, you can rapidly view it, and if you hit Control T on a node, it will get the mapping and texture coordinates, and we'll talk more about that later. And then we're going to get rid of the principal BSDF, and we want to add a diffuse BSDF, a shader to RGB, and a color ramp node. Now what that setup does is, if you've seen any of my other videos, you probably know really well by now, but basically it just creates a toon shader for our object. The diffuse BSDF is basically just like the basic CG lighting information, and shader to RGB rasterizes it so that we can treat it as something that's no longer photorealistic, which will allow us to make it, you know, toon style or whatever we want pretty much. And that color ramp, we can switch from linear to constant so that the shading is now just two values, which is how anime is a lot of the time. I'm also going to add a glossy BSDF and do the same thing. And the reason why I'm doing this is because we're going to be able to make a toon style reflection or specular effect with this. I'll explain how this shader actually works in a second after I get it constructed. I'm going to add a mix node after that. I'm going to plug the reflection mask into the FAC value and our toon shader that we had with the diffuse BSDF and the shader to RGB into the A value. And then in the B value, we can set the specular color to whatever we want pretty much. You can see here now I'm setting the colors on our toon shader to be more of like a plate type of color. I guess it's like a brownish white color. And yeah. So now I'll try and explain what this is doing to you. Basically, the diffuse BSDF on top gets the lighting information. The shader to RGB rasterizes it so that we can play with the colors. The color ramp allows us to actually play with the colors and set it to whatever we want. And then on the bottom we have a glossy BSDF, which is basically just reflective shading, reflective CG shading. And you can see that by like on the edge of the plate it has this whiteness. And you can play around with the roughness value to make it more or less reflective. That's basically what it does. And the shader to RGB rasterizes that because shaders need to be rasterized in order for you to play around with their colors. And then color ramp lets us binarize it so that it's only black and white. So basically what's going to happen is, since we're using the output of this color ramp coming from the glossy BSDF part, and we're using it as the FAC, that means we're going to be using this black and whiteness as our mask. And basically the A value corresponds to the black values in the model and the B value corresponds to the white values. So whatever's coming into the A value in this mix node is going to be set to all the areas that are black in this mask that we're using, right? So naturally, basically everything in our model is going to become the same as our like beige tune shader here, and then everything that's white, which is just these edges here, is going to become the B value that we have set in our mixed node. So I hope that makes sense. So I'm going to set it to like a bright color. I'm going to set the value to something high, and you can see now the brightness appears on the edge of the plate. I'm going to add a material for the cookie now. What we also want to do is select all of the cookies and shift select the one that you just added a material to, and then hit Control L link materials so they all now have the same material that they're using. We can add a diffuse BSDF, a shader to RGB, and a color ramp node once again. Hope you're starting to realize a pattern here. And we're going to switch it to constant, and we can set it to whatever color we want now. So I'm going to set it to, it doesn't really matter at first what color you set it to, because you can always do color correcting later and change it as you see fit. But yeah, it's up to you. You'll notice if we drag up the flags on the color ramp, we start to get the color information. Another way to do this that I did when I first made this piece of art was I increased the strength of the sunlight instead. So you can see if we increase the sunlight, what it does is it basically makes the light a lot more harsh. And so that's just something I do. I increase the sunlight to like 14 or around that. You can also click somewhere on the color ramp with Control held down to get another flag if you want. So you can see here, I made another like intermediate value, and you can see if I slide it, it's now in between the light and the shadow. What I'm going to do after that is I'm going to add a noise texture, and what I want to add is some sort of irregularness in the texture that's going to appear on our cookie. So you can play around with the scale values a bit on the noise texture, and obviously you can change it later as you see fit. And I'm going to add a map range after that, and the map range node allows us to clamp things very easily. So if you drag the from min value, you can just play around with it and clamp the noise texture so that it becomes darker in certain areas or brighter in certain areas if you play with some of the other settings. I'm going to add a color ramp after that and switch it to constant so that we can binarize this and make it just 2 shades. One other thing I should mention is when I originally made this art, I used a view transform called Filmic instead of AGX, which is the default now in 4.2. So you guys don't have to switch it if you don't want to. I just did because when I originally made this, I used Filmic for my view transform. Alright guys, so if you follow this tutorial, you'll make something pretty more or less, but the decisions as to why I chose the colors / values / composition that I did matter infinitely more than the button pressing that I'm showing you in this video. If you want to learn how to actually make your own custom designs and art and build your own worlds and characters, check out ukiyogirls.io. When you join, you'll get access to 30 plus hours of content, such as this anime-inspired character series that I just released, which will make this fully rigged character from scratch without ever even touching the shader editor, thanks to the Stylize Suite add-on, which you'll also get a copy of upon joining. And doing that will allow us to completely focus on the visual process of making our art and characters and all that stuff. You'll also get access to my ukiyo-inspired character series, my koi pond series, and my sunflower series as well. And we'll talk about observational skills too, so you can actually make your own unique, high-quality art without just following button presses in my tutorials, and you'll actually get more of an understanding of how to design your works and make artistic decisions and concepting. So if you're ready to actually master this style and level up, you can check out ukiyogirls.io. I hold nothing back inside there, and we have a private Discord community as well to help you with learning if you have any issues. Okay, back to the video. Now, one thing about these irregular cracks that we're adding is we don't really want them to be on the edges of our cookie. We just want them to be on the top, because you can see in the edges here it kind of gets stretched a bit, and that's not really something we want to appear on our model. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a gradient texture, and we're going to switch it to quadratic sphere so that it becomes a circle. And you can see it's off place a bit. Over here I'm going to switch the texture coordinate from generated to object. And hey guys, this is just me from the future. I wanted to explain to you the difference between generated and object coordinates so that you can have an understanding of why I actually switched it to object. So basically, if you look at any of your objects, you'll see you'll have this orange dot in the center, and that's called the origin point. So basically the way object coordinates works, if we plug an object into vector of our mapping node, you can see the texture is going to be centered at wherever that orange dot is. And so if I went into edit mode and I moved around this object in edit mode, you can see the orange dot is still there at the center. And so our texture is going to remain there at the center. Obviously with the mapping node, you can play around with these scale values by clicking and then dragging down, and you can just adjust it very easily like that. So the difference between that and generated is that generated, it's kind of random and you have to play around with it a bit more to get it to be in place. The advantage of it though is if you're making something that's rigged, the texture will stay in place a bit better, but we're not making something rigged here, so it doesn't really matter. So after that, you can play around with the size of the circle. Basically, you want to add a color ramp after that to binarize it once again, so that it only is on the top of our cookie. And now what we can do is we can multiply these two masks together so that we only get the noise texture in the white area on this circle gradient mask that we just made. So if we multiply the two together, you can see now it becomes excluded from the sides. In masks like this in computer graphics, basically black is 0 and white is 1. So you can imagine when we multiply the two together, the only areas that will remain white in the output is where it was white in both textures, because 1 times 1 is 1. But 1 times 0 is 0, 0 times 1 is 0, and 0 times 0 is 0. Alright, now we have to connect it up with our tune shader. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a mix node, and I'm going to plug our multiply node into the FAC, which is going to let us use our result there with the noise texture and use it as a mask. And you can see the B values are now those noise texture fragments that we had with white. And you can switch it to whatever color you want pretty much. What I like to do usually instead is I like to drag out a hue saturation value node from our previous node so that we can easily change the brightness or darkness of whatever we had previously, and then plug it into the B value so that now the B value is just going to be a hue saturation value altered version of whatever we had previously. So you can see here I'm also just changing up the colors a bit that we had in our original tune shader because I want it to be a bit more pale. Alright, after that what we can do is add a sort of crispiness to our cookies, if that makes sense. What I want to do is I want to add a gradient texture. We're going to use a circle once again, so switch it to quadratic sphere, and I'm going to use object coordinates once again. You can scale it up a bit. And pretty much I want to add a mix node in between the mapping and gradient texture node. And what this does is it allows us to add some distortion to our gradient texture, or our circle, or whatever you want to call it. And the way we can do this is we can add a noise texture and plug it into the B value of this mix node. And you can see now when we increase the factor, it kind of messes up the gradient a bit. But the issue is it's kind of moving our circle off center a bit. So instead of using mix as the blending mode, we could use divide instead. And you can actually use any of these modes and test around which one you like best, but I usually use divide because it's nice and centered by default. So yeah, you can just play around with the settings. We're going to add a map range node, and I'm going to switch it to stepped linear, which is basically the same as our usual map range node, but it converts whatever's plugged into it into steps, which is similar to how like tune shading or like anime styles work with like non-blurred shading. And so you can play around with the steps value to adjust just how many of these shading steps that you want and get something that you like. You can play around with all of the settings here as well. I don't really have any specific process for determining the values I want to use, but I just kind of play around with it until I get something that looks cool. So now what we're going to do is we're going to plug it up with another mix node. And pretty much we can add a hue saturation value node going into the A and the B values. And basically when you decrease the hue saturation value node, that's going into the A value. It's going to darken the edges, which is going to give us a sort of crispiness to our cookie. After that, I just wanted to make some color corrections, so I added an RGB curves node. This is similar to the one in Photoshop or other like drawing softwares where you can just play around on the curve and give it more or less contrast, but that's a different topic that I think you guys can watch a different video on. I'm going to add a hue saturation value node after that, and just once again play around with the values and hue and all that stuff a bit. After that, I added another mix node because we're going to be preparing to add a reflection mask for our cookie. So just like we did before, I'm going to add a glossy BSDF, a shader to RGB, and a color ramp node. And you can play around with it a bit. You can see I had two values here on the color ramp instead this time. And you can also add a noise texture and a bump node, and plug the FAC of the noise texture into the height of the bump node, and plug the bump node output into the normal for the glossy BSDF. Basically what this does, I know it's a bit convoluted, but pretty much when you slide the strength in the bump node, it's going to bump the glossy BSDF shading with the noise texture, so you can see it's messing up the shading of the glossy BSDF with the noise texture, and you can play around with it and all that, and it's pretty cool. So you can see I set the strength to like 0.1 here. It is really low. So I guess you guys don't even really need to add it here because of like how little I used it. But it was just a nice touch that I wanted to add, and I guess it's good for your education. After that, I'm going to add a hue saturation value node plugged into the B value, because remember, in our mask, the white is where the reflection is, and the B input corresponds to the white values. I also moved around our sunlight a bit because I wanted the reflection to be like a bit nicer looking. So yeah, after that, once again, I'm going to add a mix node and we're going to add a noise texture. And what we're going to be adding here is the cracks or chocolate syrup, I guess. I don't know. Originally, I wanted them to be cracks, but they kind of ended up looking like chocolate syrup. But either way, I think they look pretty good and that's what matters. So we're going to add them. So this time what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a color ramp after the noise texture, and I'm going to add a flag in the center and clamp it so that it's black in the center and white on the left and right sides. And this is going to give us this kind of cracky, I don't even think that's a word, but that's what I can describe it as. So this cracky looking thing. And you don't have to do this, but I used object coordinates here. You could have used generated as well and just played around with like the scale values to scale it down a bit and get it looking the exact same way. So it doesn't matter whether you use generated or object here, but I just ended up using object. Anyways, after that, I added a map range node and I switched it to stepped linear so that it becomes stepped again. And you guys might be a bit confused as to why we didn't just like switch the color ramp to constant and do that instead. And the answer is you could have absolutely done that. I was just being like fast here while making this model. So yeah, if you want to keep it less nodes, less confusing, you can just switch your color ramp to be constant. Now one issue here is our cracks are too connected, meaning in reality on cookies the cracks aren't like this connected. There's some areas where the cracks kind of start and end, and they're not like continuous and never ending. So what we can do is we can add a noise texture to basically fill in certain like random places on the cracks, which is going to give the illusion that these cracks have like starting and ending points. So just watch what I do here. I'm going to add a noise texture and I'm going to add a color ramp after that. And I'm going to drag out a math maximum node. You can see I did add here. That's not what I meant to do. I meant to add a maximum node. So I'm going to hit Shift Control T to duplicate this and just going to get rid of the other math node that we had before. I'm going to use maximum. And you can see now we have basically certain areas in our cracks that got filled up by our noise texture. And the reason that works is because if you just think about it from a mathematical perspective, the areas that are black in our texture correspond to 0 and the areas that are white correspond to 1. So when you take the maximum of these two, basically the only areas that show up as black is going to be the areas of our model that are both black in the new noise texture that we added and black in the cracks texture that we made. Hope that makes sense. I made a mistake after this. I added another mix node because I forgot that we had this one that we already added before. But pretty much process is the same as we've always done. You plug in our mask into the FAC and add a hue saturation value node. And you can see here I realized that I made a mistake with the mix node. So I just selected the one we had before and I hit Control X to delete while maintaining the connections. So after that, as you can see, things worked properly when I plugged in our mix node into the output. And yeah, you can see those cracks or syrup, whatever you want to call it, is starting to form. Now, what I wanted to do was some more color correction. So I'm going to go to the render management tab on the right. If you go to the color management panel and drop it down, you can see there's use curves button here. You can check the box and then you can use this curves thing and kind of drag down the points to get more contrast. So if you decrease it in the left side of the curve and increase it in the right side, what that does is it'll decrease the value in the shadow areas and increase the value in the bright areas of the scene, which adds more contrast. We also added an RGB curve before on our shaders, so you can play around with that as well. So you can see I did that there and just made some little adjustments. Wasn't completely satisfied with how our cracks turned out, so I was just playing around with it a bit more. So then after that, what I started doing was just kind of duplicating around these cookies a bit more. And I also decided it was time to add an outline for our plate. So what you can do to add it's called the solidify outline in Blender 4.2 is we can add a solidify modifier, set offset to 1, turn off fill, turn on flip in the normals tab, and set materials to -100. You can then go to the materials tab and hit the plus button to add a new material. And we want this material to just be like a color. So we're going to add an RGB node and I'm going to set it to be black and put that into the surface. After that, what you want to do is you want to basically hit this arrow button so that the black outline goes on top of our plate material in the materials tab. In the panel of the material settings here, you're going to have to go down to where it says backface culling and check the shadow option. You might have to check camera as well, but I think you just have to check shadow and that's it. So just play around with it a little and eventually this issue of it all being black should fix. And yeah, you can copy that to the plate on the bottom that we have by clicking on the plate on the bottom, shift clicking the plate on the top, and hitting Control L lick materials and Control L copy modifiers. Alright guys, it's time to start adding some fudge for our cookies or chocolate chips. So I'm going to add a cube and I'm going to go into edit mode and just right click and subdivide it a bit. You're going to see why I'm about to do this, but basically I'm going to add a subdivision surface modifier and hopefully now you can see why. Basically this lets us have these sort of beveled edges that look cute and appealing, I guess you could say. So yeah, after I'm done with that, what I'm going to do is add a displace modifier. And we already did this before, so I don't really have to talk about it much. But you just want to add some displacement to your fudge so that it isn't so perfect and it has some irregularness to it. You can also go into edit mode on your cube here and kind of like punch around the vertices a bit with proportional editing so that it becomes even more irregular, and that's what I like to do. Once you're done, you can position it onto your cookie, and yeah, you can keep on modifying it, doing whatever, and you just want to kind of duplicate these chips around all over the cookies, and you can make them look different, each one a bit different, by like obviously messing up the vertices a bit with it, and yeah. And now we're going to add the shader for it, so it's literally just going to be a diffuse PSTF shader to RGB color ramp node. And what I actually ended up doing was, for the coloring, I just used one brown color. I didn't use like a light and shadow color, so it was actually just like all brown. You can see here I'm setting it as like brownish color and trying like 2 different shades, but ultimately I just kept it all brown. I also added a glossy BSTF, a shader to RGB, and a color ramp, and I'm sure you know by this point what we're doing here. We're just making some sort of reflection. And then I combined the two up with a mix node. And that was the end of the shader for the chocolate chips. So yeah, you can start duplicating these around everywhere. I recommend that you make some of them look different than others and just make some of them look unique so that it isn't so repetitive. And you can see I'm duplicating them all around the plate. One other thing I did was I actually changed up our crispiness mask a bit with the noise texture that we had there, because I wasn't really completely satisfied with it. So I was just making some changes, and yeah, not much to say there, I think. So it'll just be like going in and testing things, seeing if it looks better if I mess up the noise texture a bit, and yeah. So yeah, after that, you're just duplicating stuff around, making sure your positioning is good, and there's not really much else to say. Alright guys, this is me from the future. I forgot to say to position your camera. So you probably don't have a camera in your scene right now, so I'm just going to get rid of the one that I have here. And what you guys want to do is you want to hit Shift A, add a camera, and then you can basically just hit Control Alt Numpad 0, and then the camera is going to be positioned to wherever you're looking. And so you'll have it selected, so you can hit G to like move it around, and hit R to like rotate it and stuff. And so I just positioned my camera to be above the cookies. So that's something I forgot to say. Now I want to add an outline to the cookies as well. So once again, not much to say there. It's literally just doing the same thing as we did for the plate to add the outline. And what you want to do is you want to select all the cookies and hit Control L Link Materials and Control L Copy Modifiers to copy the outline to all the cookies. You might notice everything turns black though. So to fix that is very easy. Just go into edit mode and hit A to select everything, and then go to your material slots and select the cookie material and then hit assign. And so now that issue is no longer there. I also moved the lighting a little bit so that it was a bit more harsh and like the shadows were more in view. And as a result of that, I had to adjust the plate object a little as well. So after that, what I did was I duplicated the plate out because now I want to add a milkshake. So I'm going to add a circle, and what I'm going to do is basically extrude down from it and basically just make like a glass shape as if we're making a glass or something, because that's basically what we're doing. And it's up to you however you want this to look. It's just basic modeling pretty much. And yeah, you can add a solidify modifier to it to give it some thickness. And what I actually want to do is right click and shade auto smooth. And what that'll do is it'll add a shade auto smooth modifier or smooth by angle, whatever it's called. I also duplicated the top loop. With Shift T, I hit P by selection to separate it as its own object. And what this is going to be is it's going to be the fudge. So you can see I extruded in and then I extruded down as well. So the fudge is like falling down on the glass. And now what we can do here is we can start to kind of model as if some sort of fudge is falling. And you can hit Control 1 to add a subdivision modifier as well, so that it becomes smoother. And yeah, it's just a process here of modeling fudge going down. You can look at some pictures of what that looks like on milkshakes and stuff, and you just want to make it look appealing. It's a pretty repetitive process, so I think we can skip through most of it. But yeah, you can download the file if you want to see exactly what it was like in the end. You can also add a solidify modifier to the fudge to give it some thickness. To make the milk itself, I'm going to hit Shift D to duplicate the glass, then I'm going to scale it down a bit. And what I want to do is I want to go into edit mode and fill the top of it. And yeah, that's pretty much it for making the model for the milk itself. Now what I want to do is I want to make the whipped cream. So the process for doing this that I use is basically you add a cylinder, set vertices to 12, set the cap fill type to triangle fan, which is going to basically make it so that the top of our cylinder has these poked faces, or like these triangles, whatever you want to call them. And then you can hit Control R, and you want to add 5 loop cuts through the model. Then you can add a simple deform modifier, set the axis to Z, and set the angle to be around 125. And then you can apply that modifier. And then you can go into edit mode and you want to alt click every other edge that's going through this model pretty much. And then you can hit S Shift to Z to basically create this whirling effect. You can then add a subdivision modifier, and you can add a simple deform after that, and we're going to use the taper option this time, and you can play around with that. And then we're going to once again add a final simple deform with twist, and you can just twist it. So yeah, that's basically how you make whipped cream really easily. And you can of course keep on playing around with the model itself if you go into edit mode. After that, what I want to do is I want to add the kind of wood table that goes under the cookies and everything. So I'm just going to add a cube and scale it in Y, make it kind of like a wooden slab looking thing. And what you can do is add an array modifier so that this slab just keeps on repeating. And you can set the count to whatever you like. You can also play around with the relative offset feature for how far apart you want these planks to be. And then we can add a bevel modifier. And what that's going to do is it's going to bevel the edges on these wooden slabs, which will make it look a bit nicer. And you'll notice right now that when we slide the offset, it's not beveling properly, like it's uneven for some reason. And what you can do to fix that is you can hit Control A and apply all transforms, which is going to fix that issue. I also went into the model and edit mode and I kind of like made the bottom slanted a bit. So that's something that's optional you can do if you want. And yeah, so that's pretty easy. Now for the shader for the table, it's really simple. We're just going to add a basic toon shader like we've done for pretty much every other material in the scene so far. And I'm going to set it to a brownish color. And yeah, now what I want to do is I want to make the glass of milk. So I'm going to add a circle and we're going to make just a basic shape for a kind of glass. Extrude down a bit. Fill the bottom, and I'm going to add a solidify modifier so that it has some thickness. And then I'm going to add another circle, and this circle is going to be the actual milk object itself. So I'm just going to position it inside of the glass, extrude down, and I'm also going to want to make sure that I fill the top of it. And then after I fill the top, I also beveled the edges on the top as well, because I thought that made it look a bit nicer. And that's something that's optional to do. You don't have to if you don't want to. And yeah, what we're going to do now is we're going to make the shader for the glass on our milkshake. So this used to be way easier to do in versions below 4.1 when I first made this art, but now it's a bit more convoluted, which is why the version we make here, the glass won't look as good, unfortunately, as it did before Blender 4.2. But basically, my method now for making glass in this type of style is I'm going to add a glossy BSDF, and you can see what that is obviously it's just a glossy material. And what I want to do is I want to go to the settings on the right hand side, and I'm going to enable ray tracing. And what that's going to do is it's going to make our glossy BSDF shader look a lot cooler pretty much. And I'm going to add a mix shader node, and what we're going to mix this glossy shader with is we're going to mix it with transparency. So you can see we mix those two together, and now what I want to do is I want to add a Fresnel node and plug it into the FAC. And basically what Fresnel does is pretty much the edges of the object that you're looking at will be more white and the center of the object that you're looking at will be more black. So if you play around with the Fresnel node IOR value, index of refraction, that's what it stands for, you can see now we can slide the transparency. Now for our milk object in the center, what we're going to want to do is do the same setup that we've always been using with the diffuse BSDF, shade with RGB, and color ramp node, except I'm not going to switch the color ramp to be constant this time, because I actually think for milk, linear looks a bit nicer. Like you kind of do want some of that blurriness when it comes to milk, so yeah. Due to the glass, you might notice that your milk kind of starts looking a bit weird. I think the way to fix this is if you select your glass object and you go to visibility, you can click on and off this shadow button, and if you turn it off, it should fix your issue. Anyways, now it's time to do the shader for the fudge. It's going to be extremely simple. I don't even have to say much at all. We're just going to be giving it a brownish color with light and dark values, and I'm also going to have a glossy BSDF setup that we've been using a lot up until this point to give it some reflection as well. And the reflection isn't going to be like super intense, but it will indeed be there to make the fudge more realistic. For the whipped cream, same thing, extremely simple shader. We're just going to be using a diffuse and a glossy, and we're going to be able to determine our values like that. One thing I will say for whipped cream though is the shadow tends to be for some reason a yellowish color a lot of the time, so whatever shadow color you pick, maybe try and incorporate some yellow into it. So yeah. Anyways, after being done with that, we can add our glass shader that we already made on our milkshake to our milk glass, and you might have to play around with the values a bit to get it to look more adjusted properly. But yeah, it's the same thing as what we did for the milkshake pretty much, nothing different there. And you can disable shadow on the ray visibility so that the shading of the milk on the inside doesn't get messed up too much. Now to make the shader for the milk itself, it's going to be the same as we did for the milkshake, except we're going to be using a whiter color here instead of a brown one. And so yeah, that starts to look pretty interesting. And I also decided that I want to add a gradient where it's lighter on the top and darker on the bottom, so I'm going to add a mix node, and we're going to add a gradient texture. This time we'll be using linear instead of quadratic sphere, because linear is like a just regular gradient. You might have to play around with the rotation features in the mapping node like I did here until you get it rotated properly. It's kind of just a guessing game, to be honest, so just type in 90 in random places until it works. That's what I do all the time. Now for the straw, we're going to be doing something pretty cool. We're going to be using a wave texture to give it a sort of striped pattern that is common in a lot of like these milk straw looking things. For some reason I had to rotate it 90 degrees in both X and Z. I don't know why that was, but as I said, I just kind of like test rotating it 90 until it looks properly. And so that's what I figured out eventually. And you can see we have these bands and you can rotate them a bit. And pretty much what you can do after that is add a color ramp node and switch it from linear to constant so that we just have two shades. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to make one of them white and one of them red. It should be the opposite of what I did here. So I'm going to fix that real soon. And yeah, you also want to add a diffuse PSTF, a shader to RGB, and a color ramp so that we can get the lighting information. And what we can do is we can use a mix multiply node. And the difference between the regular multiply and the mix multiply is that the mix multiply supports color, whereas the other blue multiply node doesn't support colors. So we can just use this instead. And you can see we're multiplying our stripes by the shading. And so as a result, we now get our lighting for our straw. I also decided I wanted to add a gradient for the other milk that we made for the milkshake. So I'm just adding that here as well, making it brighter on the top than it is on the bottom. And that'll help it look a bit more realistic, just a bit. I also duplicated the milk that we made towards the front of the camera as well so that we have like two milks now, just to add some more detail to the scene. And now what I want to do is I want to add some crumbs, some cookie crumbs going around the scene to give more detail. So you can just duplicate one of these chocolate chip objects that we made and you can just set its material to be the cookie one. And I found that it actually looks pretty cool doing this, so we don't have to make like a whole new cookie crumb material. So yeah, you can just do that. And I duplicated our cookie material and I renamed it to crumbles so that now it's separate from the actual cookie material itself, and we can start duplicating these around now pretty easily. What I want to do now is I want to start adding some depth of field to our camera. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add an empty, and you can hit F2 to rename it. I usually call my empty focus, so I'll just rename it to focus, and I position the empty in the center of where the cookies is. And then you can click on your camera and go to the depth of field settings, hit the checkbox to enable it, and set f-stop to a low value. And for focus on object, you can set it to focus, which is the name of the empty that we just added. And so now when you move around that empty, it's going to kind of adjust the focus of the camera. So yeah, this f-stop option is the only one that really matters. You usually set it to something pretty low, like 0.10, 0.14. That's what I did here. And yeah, so after that, I kept on adding crumbles and chocolate chips around the scene to make sure that we have a sufficient amount of detail so that it doesn't look so boring. I also decided to duplicate the milkshake so that we could have something take up the scene a bit more. Obviously, we didn't really finish the back of it much, but it doesn't really matter because the back isn't going to be seen by the camera anyways. Unless in your scene, you want the back to be seen, but that's up to you. Regarding compositing, if you go to the compositing editor, you can check the use nodes button, and it's really simple. You can just add a glare effect and position it in between the composite and the render layers. And what I like to do is I like to switch it to bloom. And if you go to the top right, next to the rendered view button, you can set composite to be always. And so once you enable that, you're going to actually see the effects of the bloom. And you can just play around with it a bit. This is, in the end, what I set my settings to for the bloom. And it just gives a nice overall effect to your scene. I also went back to our curves, and for the white level, I found that decreasing black made it look a bit more magenta, which kind of looked a bit nicer. So I did that. I set it to like 0.88. One other thing I wanted to do with the table shader, you can see it's pretty flat and plain right now. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to add a noise texture. And what I did with this noise texture was I kind of wanted to use it to give our table a sort of wood texture. So this isn't going to be anything that's unfamiliar to you guys at this point. I'm just going to add a map range node to kind of clamp things a bit and get it to look the way I want. And I'm going to switch that map range to step linear so that I can make it just non-blurry and more anime looking. And I'm going to add a mix node. We're going to plug in the mask that we just made to the FAC, and then I'm going to add a hue saturation value node, plug into the B value, and now we can control the darkness or brightness of those white areas in the mask that we just made with the noise texture. And so you can just keep on playing around with it until you get something that looks nice. And this is just going to give our scene a little bit more detail and make it look a bit nicer. Lastly, I also wanted to add a glossy BSTF so that we can catch some of the light hitting the edges of the planks. So I'm going to add that, and same as we've always been doing, just add a shader to RGB, a color ramp node, and pretty much you can see we have a mask with the kind of like edges of our table now because that's where the light is hitting. This creates one issue though, which is if you go out of the camera view, you can see the glossiness is too harsh if you're looking at it from like the top. And so in order to avoid that, we could have like texture painted along the edges to make them brighter instead of using a glossy BSDF, but that's a topic for another video. So yeah, after that, we are pretty much completely done. Not much else to do at this point besides maybe make some small changes. And I hope you guys learned a lot in this video. Once again, if you want to actually learn how to revolutionize your art and unlock the secrets behind this style and beautiful art in general, you can check out ukiyogirls.io. I'll see you in the next video, guys. Thank you for watching.